Hello everyone, and welcome to my presentation about protecting Maaloula from the Syrian conflict, local and international efforts for protection. First of all, I'd like to introduce an overview of the Syrian civil war. Major civil unrests broke out in Damascus, Aleppo and Deraa on 15th of March 2011, with protesters demanding democratic reforms and the release of political prisoners. Protests were triggered by the arrest and torture of a group of teenage boys a few days earlier in the city of Deraa over graffiti denouncing President Bashar al-Assad. A violent crackdown and repression by the secular Assad regime followed. In July 2011, defectors from the military announced the formation of the Free Syrian Army, FSA, a rebel group aiming to overthrow the government, turning the revolt into a civil war. Protests continued into 2012, but various rebel groups also emerged, with some receiving support from foreign powers, such as SDF by the US and SIG by the US and Turkey, while some groups also recruit foreign fighters. Assad is supported by Russia, Iran, and Lebanon-based Shiite group Hezbollah. Some rebel groups follow radical Islamist ideologies, suppress non-Sunni and non-Muslim populations, and damage non-Islamic sites and artifacts with sectarian zeal. For example, Al-Nusra Front, an al-Qaeda affiliate, was formed in 2011 against the Assad government. It assaulted and twice occupied the Syrian village of Maaloula, near capital Damascus, and was accused of murdering the local population, desecrating, looting, and destroying Christian artifacts in churches and monasteries. The rise of these groups by 2015, especially the Islamic State, saw historical cities and sites such as Raqqa, Palmyra, and Dura Europos, and their antiquities damaged or destroyed. Nevertheless, with Russian intervention, the government forces managed to regain territories and further stabilize the situation. The Arab nations came to realize that Bashar al-Assad will remain in power. After having been suspended from the Arab League in 2011, the Assad regime is now recognized again by neighboring Arab states and will be readmitted to the Arab League. Here is a map of Syria in March 2023. In this map we can see that the Syrian government now controls territories in central and southern Syria, and US-backed SDF, which includes Kurdish militants, controls the country's northeast, and there is a US military base on the southeastern town of Al-Tanf. Turkey and its allied rebel groups occupied parts of the north. Free Syrian Army and HTS, which incorporates al-Nusra and other groups, occupied parts of the northwest. The Islamic State, ISIS, which once controlled a large part of central and northern Syria, is now isolated in several strongholds. There are signs that ISIS is regrouping and trying to expand again. Here's a brief chronology of Syria. The left half of the table are mainly the events that happened before Islamic conquest in 636 AD, and the right half are those after Islamic conquest. Notably, President Bashar al-Assad and his father Hafez belonged to the Arab Socialist Party of Ba'ath, which came to power through a coup d'etat in Syria in 1963. Next, I would like to talk about the significance of Maaloula in this conflict. Located 50 kilometers northeast of Damascus, Maaloula is a predominantly Christian village, with Greek and Antiochian Orthodox and Greek Melkite Catholic residents. The village has two major monasteries dated as far back as 4th century AD, which are St. Sarkis or Sergius Monastery of Melkite Church and St. Thecla Monastery of the Orthodox Church. Being one of the earliest Christian communities with some of the oldest Christian icons, Maaloula is linguistically unique that its residents can still speak Aramaic. The language is believed by some scholars to have been used by Jesus Christ. The village had also been a popular pilgrimage destination by Christians and Muslims alike before the civil war erupted. Its 2004 population, according to the Syrian Bureau of Statistics, was 2,762, while this number would often increase considerably during the summer holidays, with families from Damascus staying in the village. The village is on the UNESCO tentative World Heritage List. Though the village is inside the Kalamun mountain region, it is close to key smuggle routes to sustain rebel strongholds. Control of the village changed hands at least 4 times during the Civil War. Sectarian fighters aimed to occupy this village as a trophy for Islam, and to eliminate the village's Christian values in terms of humans and objects. President Bashar al-Assad visited the heavily damaged village in April 2014 and pledged to restore Maaloula to its ancient beauty. Here is a table of the major stakeholders of this conflict and the preservation of Maaloula's cultural heritage. We have pro-Assad belligerents, anti-Assad belligerents, international conservation groups, international Christian organizations, and residents. For the pro-Assad belligerents, headed by the Assad regime, Maaloula is a symbol of harmony of Syria and a symbol of Christian-Muslim coexistence. For anti-Assad belligerents, for example al-Nusra, it is alleged of vandalizing of icons, statues, churches, monasteries, and persecutions of Christians as a weapon of war to conquer Maaloula and purify it according to radical Islamist ideals. There were propaganda and counter-propaganda of the rival groups. Some of them blamed the government for terrorizing the minorities. There are difficulties of gathering evidences of who was accountable, and some rebels acted moderately. The FSA pledged, or the Free Syrian Army pledged to exclude Maaloula from its conflict zone with the government, yet heavy fighting continued after this announcement. There is also allegation by some Western media that Western imperialists used the opposition to oust Assad and recolonize Syria. For the international conservation groups, there are difficulties of access to the village and record casualties and damage, partly due to Assad's restrictions on independent media. International organizations secretly record damages, such as those recorded by UNESCO, ICOMOS, Blue Shield, Heritage for Peace, Heritage Task Force, but there is no authoritative list of destruction in Syria. Though ICOM's emergency red list for Syria didn't specifically mention Christian icons or statues, it did urge museums, auction houses, and collectors to conduct careful provenance research on any cultural objects from Syria. As for the international Christian organizations, from Vatican, Pope Francis called for prayers from the faithful for the captured Greek Orthodox nuns. As for the Orthodox Ecumenical Patriarchate in Constantinople and its senior church leaders, they voiced their support for Syrian Christians, condemned terrorism and religious defamation, demanded immediate liberation of kidnapped bishops and nuns. And they also commended Christians' dual martyrdom for their faith and for safeguarding their historical relationships with people of other faiths. For the resident groups, residents fled Maaloula for other parts of Syria, for example Damascus. Some residents chanted, "Maaloula is the wound of Christ," when they were mourning for the 3 residents killed after refusing to convert to Islam. 6 others were kidnapped and missing. 15 nuns were also kidnapped and later released. Many residents fear that if the secular Assad government is overthrown, they will be targeted by Sunni jihadist rebels fighting for an Islamic state, and that Christian communities will be destroyed. Some clergymen expressed public support of Assad, but most residents were neutral. They had overwhelming feelings of mourning, fear, and betrayal by the West, and the hope to rebuild the village and trust, and also a resistance against forced conversion. The residents are also seeking prayers from outsiders, and they also noticed that sectarianism emerged after some of the residents worked in Qatar and Saudi Arabia. As for the lootings and restorations of the churches in Maaloula, we can look at a few cases here. First of all, for the lootings, according to the Syrian International News Agency's coverage, the retreating Islamists took everything valuable from the churches, including ancient icons, historical manuscripts, icon lamps and altar crosses, church furnishings, tombstones, and other valuable items. The militants destroyed everything they could not hastily take along, and some of the buildings were burnt. After the liberation under the support of the government of Syria, the citizens of Maaloula started rebuilding churches, assembling church furnishings, religious books, and other objects, piece by piece. The Christians tried not only to rebuild Maaloula, they tried to rebuild the relationship between them and the Muslims shattered by ISIS. Also as an example, in this case of looting, St. Sarkis Monastery's 16th and 18th century icons, which were once decorating the church walls, are still missing. They are believed to be sold or destroyed by jihadists. Second case of repatriation. 5 icons were looted by militants and to be sold on the black market. They were intercepted at the Syrian-Lebanese border and relocated at the Syrian Orthodox Patriarchate in Damascus. 3 of them were later returned to Maaloula, but there appears to be no report of other major recovery of looted Maaloula objects, especially from overseas. The third case of St. Sekla Monastery being restored and opened to visitors again. The monastery chaplain Father Elias Ades returned to Maaloula once the militants retreated. According to him, 90% of the reconstructions were already done, and tourists were returning by 2018. Here is a brief provenance chart of Maaloula's Christian icons as an example. From its first century or early few centuries of creations of the icons, their use in the monasteries in Maaloula from the 4th to the 21st century, and their looting, destruction, and damage by the militants during the Civil War, their repair after the government retook the area, and also the interception of some of the icons and repatriation back to Maaloula. So what are the key ethical issues in this case? First of all, we identify the difficulties of prioritizing saving human lives versus protecting cultural heritages, given the limited resources available to achieve both at Maaloula and in Syria. Secondly, there's the issues of recording evidence and confirming accountability for cultural genocide and heritage atrocities at Maaloula. There's the difficulty of access to Maaloula and Syria in general by journalists, partly due to Assad regime's restrictions. Also, a lack of record of how the objects left Syria can make these objects enter the art market more easily. It can also make biased provenance research and repatriation harder. Western collecting institutions may, depending on their country's implementation of the 1970 UNESCO Convention and the scope of their bilateral art trade restriction agreements with Syria, refuse to return the objects. Possible justifications of such refusals include lack of evidence of illegal removal of the objects from Syria against Syrian law, and also lack of evidence connecting the objects with Maaloula's churches or any church or religious monuments in Syria. Thirdly, the international society's general reluctance to cooperate with the Assad regime faces dilemma here. Foreign governments and NGOs should reconsider conservation and humanitarian aid and repatriation to Maaloula, given Assad's commitment, or stronger commitment compared to the militant groups, to protect the lives of local residents and maintain the village's cultural values. At the same time, the foreign entities should also be aware of Assad's use of cultural property as a lever for support, and also keep aid at arm's length. So my discussion question for the group is it too costly for the returned residents to keep Maaloula's multicultural and multi-religious identities living and on display for visitors at the risks of their own lives and their properties, with anti-government militants still active in some rural areas? Or should this intangible heritage of multi-religious society be an example for places with low religious tolerance, and to educate the broader societies domestically and globally, such as making this tentative heritage a World Heritage Site? Here's an image of the destruction of the icons in a Maaloula church. Here are my references, and thank you for your attention.